Good evening. I don't know who the last speaker microphone one was, but they sure did wad up the cord real good. So it's like a fishing line after I go out fishing as well. So good evening to you. Glad to be back. Had a couple people ask how the weekend trip went. Went great. I saw lots of things all by myself in Western North Carolina. I went to the store and went to a football game and drove across the bridge. It did all those kinds of things and reported back faithfully to Mary after it was all said and done. And she appeared to see the bed and then the couch and then the chair and then back to the couch. So and the TV and all that. It wasn't great, but it was fine. Huh? The deck. That's oh yeah, the deck. Yeah. Yeah, the deck is all of those kinds of things. But it was can't help it. It's just how Mary said, she said, I've gotten all these shots. I've avoided everything. And then the one weekend we go somewhere is when she gets sick. So, but anyway, I had to practice my compassion and empathy during this time. Tonight, we're talking about compassion and empathy. We don't have a specific lesson tonight. In fact, we're going to be looking at numerous brief examples from the Bible. Most of our scriptures that we're going to be looking at are just 2 or 3 or 4 verses. There's one that's about 15 verses, but we'll be all over the place. So if you've got your Bible, you probably need your Bible to be able to flip back and forth. But everything we need will be up here on the board. We're talking about compassion and empathy. I think we talk about the word compassion quite a bit. I don't think we talk about the word empathy enough. This is a conversation that me and one of my coworkers had often. And one of the things that I think some people struggle with is empathy. Have you ever heard somebody say something along the lines of, I hate that for you? You ever heard that? They don't mean that. You know, I mean, I'm not saying not everybody does, but somebody, I've been guilty of this, I hate that for you. And I don't even think another thing about it. But when we think about what empathy is, we're going to talk a little bit more about it here as we go. It's in a sense trying to put ourselves into the shoes of that person. Part of the reason we don't always like to put ourselves into the shoes of that person, we don't want to deal with that. You know, that's somebody else's problem. I got other things that I am dealing with. But one of the first things we want is when we're dealing with something, I need you to understand what I'm going through. And we struggle sometimes with empathy and putting ourselves into that. I would argue that empathy is a trained skill. I don't know that we're necessarily born empathetic. There may be some of that in us, but we have to practice this a little bit. And much like anything, the less we practice, the less good we're going to be at it. That can't be the right way to say that. But the more we practice, then hopefully the better we will be at it. So we're going to look tonight at some biblical examples of compassion and empathy. I want to talk, though, we do this for each one of these, and in some examples of compassion in the Old Testament. The first one, Exodus chapter 22 and verse 27. For that is his only covering, it is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. Concern for someone's well-being. And then I am gracious toward them. That's an example maybe that's right there. Staying across the top, Exodus 34 and verse 6. And the Lord passed before him. I'm going to get closer and closer and keep making this smaller. And proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth. Somebody who is compassionate or empathetic would be described in a way that we see there in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 6. Across the bottom, Lamentations 3 and 22. Through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed because his compassions fail not. You may remember several months ago when we were studying the book of Lamentations, and it's a series of 5 poems about the fall of Israel. And they were 20, the first 2 and the last 2 chapters are 22 verses, and the middle chapter was 44. But it was about this sadness and concern about what had happened, but it said his compassions fail not. Last one, Psalm 86 and verse 15. But you, O Lord, are a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in mercy and truth. So it's just a few Old Testament verses We go on to the New Testament, you'll see this as well. Matthew 14:14. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Almost every example of compassion goes back to Jesus in some form or another. Down at the bottom, Ephesians 4 and verse 32, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. And it's the last part of the verse that I'm sure we're all familiar with, even as God in Christ forgave you. So if we're going to be compassionate and empathetic to someone, the question might be, well, why do I need to do that? Well, where's the best example? Jesus showed compassion toward us as well. Colossians 3:12, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, long suffering. And the last one, 1 Peter 3:8, finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous. So just some examples here of Old Testament and New Testament compassion. Let's talk a little bit about what the two things are. First of all, empathy. Okay, so I found this. I thought this kind of worked pretty good. I want to look at the picture though first. What's the two people in the picture doing? They're hugging. There's an embrace here, and it definitely seems like that there's some. I know it's a story about compassion and empathy. It's probably not a "I'm in love with you on the first date" kind of hug right here, but rather a sort of sadness that's with it. But empathy, this feeling for someone. I understand what you're going through. I've been there. Well, we haven't all been there. We've all experienced some things, but some of us have experiences that others haven't. But trying to put ourselves into that spot or trying to compare, we'll come back to that a little bit more a little bit later. And then compassion, feeling for someone and a desire to help. I can understand your distress and I want to help. And these are situations, I think this lesson can be helpful for us because I think these are things that we face on a day-to-day basis. And we'll look at some religious examples, but we'll also look at maybe some application for our own lives as well. So when we think about loving our neighbors, helping our neighbors, what comes to mind? What comes to mind when we hear we need to love and to help our neighbors? What pops into your head? So a list of tasks that we could come up with that somebody might need help with because they're physically unable. It could be because they're elderly or they went through a surgery or something like that. What other things maybe come to mind for us when we think about helping or loving our neighbor? Okay. Right. It is. Right. So, but maybe the question then, is it enough to sympathize with somebody's plight or to express sorrow for their lot in life? Not enough. And a couple of questions. What does sympathy provide? There's a place for sympathy. Absolutely. A level of comfort there. What does sympathy change?
It changes emotions and attitude and feelings when someone knows that someone's being sympathetic. It takes that loneliness away, that you know that you've got someone to share with and you're not going through it.
Sure. Uh-huh. Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't. That's exactly right. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. And I think that sometimes we think about that when we think about people that are in distress or need or whatever. It's like, well, after a couple weeks it'll be fine. And there's some truth to that. After a couple, you do move on with anything, but there's also this sort of repeated need that would come back, that would reveal itself again. Sure.
Do that sympathy or share that sympathy with someone, it causes you to have a stronger bond with that person, be more open to other people's problems and stuff, and be less self-absorbed.
So that's a really good thing that Ben just said, because it leads kind of into our next thing. To extend love to others requires that we have to have some understanding of something about what their needs are, right? We have to put ourselves in their shoes. It may mean that we have to ask some questions. And the first question that we're always going to ask is, what can I do for you? But that's the easy question, right? Because I hope that somebody, when I say, what can I do for you? I hope the answer is, I need you to go to the store. I can do that. No trouble. Or it'd be nice if you would mow the yard. I can do that. Those are kind of those checklist tasks that we want. But sometimes that question's hard to answer because there maybe isn't necessarily something that we can physically do. Because physically doing something is easy. It's hard work, but it's easy. But there's some emotional, and sometimes we don't want to get into that sort of emotional level, and we maybe make this is more than I can handle. I don't know that I want to deal with this. So sometimes to develop empathy, and we're talking about developing empathy, sometimes we have to recognize, we have to educate ourselves about groups and circumstances that we have to be able to be empathetic towards. I'm going to say this as a school teacher. I have about 120 kids over the course of the day. And I can tell you this, there are 120 different kinds of kids that walk into that room. And there are things that I can say to one of them that I could not say to another one for anything in the world. And there are some of them that if I even raise my voice the slightest little bit, they'll be in tears. And there's other ones that I could probably yell at for 20 minutes and they wouldn't bother them one bit. But everybody's different. There are kids that are dealing with issues that are hard for me to grasp. For instance, I have kids who have parents who might as well, you could just say, don't exist. I cannot relate to that as somebody whose parents were always there. But I can't just say, well, I'm sorry, 15-year-old, I can't relate to this. I'm not, because I have to find an understanding of that. So what I have to do, what I need to do is figure out how can I sort of develop this empathy for a situation that I maybe can't relate to. And it's harder because they may be of a different generation. Every kid I deal with is of a different generation. I had kids the other day tell me, it's like, well, the year I was born. I was like, well, I've been teaching for 5 years. The day you was born right there. It's hard for me to understand that. You have people like that you come in contact with. The people that you work with are not the same age as you. The people who live next door to you may not be the same age as you. Mm-hmm.
That's the reason Jesus went through what he went through, so he could do that for us. And I think sometimes some of the hardest and pain that we go through on this earth is to enable us, like Joseph, for the next time we need to help somebody else who maybe couldn't handle it on their own.
Absolutely. And so when we think about empathy, then what we're thinking about here is, how can I not only help you, but how can I better understand the situation that you are involved in? And I'm just going to be real honest with you. I don't know that the church has always done a very good job of that at all. Because I think the church in many ways likes cookie cutters, that we can kind of mold this and this is what it needs to be. And you're different than everybody else. And you got to fix it, rather than us trying to understand differences of what it is. And I'm saying that, and I can be blamed for that just as much as anyone else. Boo. I think so. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. Uh-huh. I think there's some truth that to that, but I think sometimes if we're not careful, we put a sharp divide there, and we say I can't cross that other that other line. Yes. Yes. Sure. Sure. Your hand was raised. Sorry. Right. Sure. Right. Sure.
I think a lot of times empathy too. The best thing that most empathetic thing to do is just listen.
Yeah.
Just let them hug you for 5 minutes if they
Yeah.
want. I know when Ron died, Zach hugged me for 10 minutes. Zach's a big boy.
Right.
And he got squashed me. And I don't care if he hugs me till I'm
Right.
because he's grandpa.
Sure. Sure.
I think it's a lot like what you were saying too. You have to build that up. You have to be able to put yourself, whether you've been in that situation or not, in that person's shoes. Like Abraham Lincoln said, there goes someone I don't like. I need to get to know him better, be able to put myself in his shoes.
Right.
But the more you do that, you get outside of yourself and put yourself in that homeless person situation, that drug addict situation, whatever they're going through, the more you're able to do that, the better you become that.
We're going to look at several examples in the New Testament tonight of compassion or empathy or both, whatever word you want to use. But I want you to think about just things that you know from about Jesus. How many times did Jesus help or do a miracle, whatever it was? How many times was it with somebody that, by our definition, we'd say he didn't even know? It was somebody who was, we might call him a rank stranger, right? We know what that word is. And there are so many examples. There's other examples where Jesus, I think about Lazarus when it was his close friend or whatever. But there's a lot of examples of just sort of, we would almost call random people that Jesus helped. And he oftentimes willingly, what Ben was saying a minute ago, sort of willingly associated with people that you would not have hung out with, or that you would have almost been worried about your reputation had you said something to that person. And so I want us to think about that tonight. So we're going to look at several examples. And really, the only question I have for you on every one of these, and I think there's 7 of them, the only question that I really have for you is, where was the compassion? Where was the empathy? Okay? And that's what we're looking for. And then we'll follow it up with, how can I do this in my life? Obviously, you can't you can't raise somebody from the dead. I don't mean that. But what is the lesson that the compassion or the empathy that I can take from this and apply it going forward? Let's talk first, though, about the compassion of Jesus. This is Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38. Linda, do you care to read this one? Matthew 9, 35 through 38. All right. So this is just sort of, to me, a good set of verses about the compassion of Jesus. And I want us to look at this this set of verses kind of almost halfway. And so if we can draw a line sort of between the people and the period and the word but right here. The first part right there, how would you describe, where's the compassion in this? Okay.
They need all of that.
This is a list, right? There's comma of things listed. Said he went to all the cities and villages. You can interpret the word all however you want to, but I've been to every building in town this week. We know what that means. You've really not stopped going. All the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing their sickness and every disease among the people. Does it seem like Jesus was busy going about his Father's business right here. And so there's compassion there, because I would imagine if we want to envision Jesus being coming to this earth and living as a man, there were probably times when Jesus was tired, right? There were probably times, man, I tell you what, I just don't hardly know if I can go one more place. We can all relate to that, right? But he says then in that second part, when he saw the multitudes, all these people, it said he was what? Moved with compassion for them. Not just, well, what does moved with compassion mean?
I think that's a perfect word picture. We all can imagine seeing a little lamb stuck in briars or something like that. Every one of us, we see a little lamb by itself, what do we all want? I mean, I don't care how many you are, you're going to run over and you're going to help that little sheep.
Right.
Because you're just going to be like that. That's the perfect word picture to me.
So he was moved with compassion. Mom, what were you going to say? Or did Dan take yours?
Oh, I just said he saw that those people had needs.
Yeah. But it almost seems like there's a period and then it says, but then, or but when he saw it, almost, and for us, if we're not careful, we might get to that period and say, I've done enough, right? I've went to the cities and villages. I've talked in the synagogues. I've preached. I've healed their sickness. I've dealt with all the disease. Instead of it saying, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved. But when he saw the multitudes, he was like, man, I wish somebody else would do this. Do we sometimes get into that pretty easily? So we have a measure of compassion, but maybe not a complete, full tank of empathy, compassion, whatever it might would be. But Jesus has been said there. He saw them because he looked at them weary and scattered like sheep having what? And who is the shepherd? It's Jesus, right? Jesus, the loving shepherd, as the song goes, right? And so it was almost like the old saying, if it's to be, it's up to me. And it kind of was like, this is my job, right? Jesus will say something like that right before he's dead. He says, for this hour is what I came for, right? This was his task that he had to do. Sure, absolutely. Uh-huh. Yes. No, I agree. And then one of Jesus's tasks was going to have to be to develop a cadre of people that was going to come after him, because his life was going to be short, right? And so if he doesn't do anything, what's going to happen to the church's existence? Can it exist? No. And so the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And some of these people that he's going to be working with are going to be trained to be laborers as well. Yeah.
He's dealing too with the people that are defeated people. We've got the Roman brothers, the iron hand, Lord.
Sure.
Everything that they say or do, the government is there. And I mean, they're subject to the winds that go, and they can have them stuffed out.
Sure.
In a moment. And these people are, after a while, that gets old.
Yeah.
You kind of lose your pizzazz. You don't have the energy. And it seems almost hopeless.
Right.
And he sees that. But now he's going to instill hope.
Right.
This is what they've been looking for.
What about this? This is one that I think we'll be familiar with. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. That's not real big, so you might want to take this from your own Bible instead. Lucille, do you care to read this one? It's Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. If you turn over a page in Matthew 15, you'll see a real similar story, feeding of 4,000 right here. But if we divide this again into two parts, he leaves and goes to a deserted place. The New King James says desert. I think the Old King James says desert. Whatever. There's not a lot going on in this place. But Jesus goes. But who goes with? Who goes as well? The multitude, they followed him in the process. Well, if you want to follow me to Walmart, I can probably help you. But if you want to follow me into the middle of the desert, it's going to be a little hard, right? And so he speaks with them. He's moved compassion with them in verse 14, which is almost word for word what we just read in Matthew chapter 9. But he was moved with compassion for them, healed their sick. And when it was evening, what did the disciples say to him? You can almost these people have to go home, because why? It's getting late. They're hungry. We don't have any food. I'm tired. All the kind of things. They need to go. But Jesus almost the immediate response from Jesus is what? He said they don't need to go away at all. But then he says, you give them something to eat. Well, the challenge is extended back to the people because this is really difficult, right? It's really difficult to give somebody something to eat when you don't have anything for you. What did they have? They said, we have here 5 loaves and 2 fishes. You can read that verse as saying we ain't got nothing. I know what the verse says, but really what he's saying, we ain't got nothing. You might as well say we got got a bag over here, ain't got nothing left in it. But Jesus said, what? Bring them here to me. Told them to sit down. This is a miracle of what they have. Now, where is the compassion right here? Okay.
Especially with the kids in the desert and stuff. So he was moved with compassion, put himself. He'd been 40 days without. He knew what it was like to be hungry.
Sure.
So that moved him with compassion, take care of what they need.
Absolutely. Do we see any other compassion? I think maybe compassion. I don't know if this is the right word, but he sort of puts it on the disciples here, right? It's sometimes we need to be challenged by other people to see what we're capable of doing here, right? And the real easy answer with him, when Jesus said, they don't need to go away, you give them something to eat. The real easy answer is the exact answer that the disciples gave, right? They said what? We have only 5 loaves and 2 fishes. They limited, right? They limited Jesus' ability. Were they right on the math? They absolutely were right. The itemized list of things they had was pretty small right there. And they said, we only, what they're really saying is we don't have anything and we can't do anything about this there, right? Do we sometimes face challenges that same way? Do we sometimes look at this and say, I can't really do anything about this situation? Are we the glass half empty sometimes in this? Well, I'm sure it would to be that. And so Jesus then says, he takes control, as it were, of the situation right there and solves the problem. Now, at the very beginning, the disciples said, we need to send these people home. And Jesus absolutely right then could have said what? That's probably right. It is late. Go on home. Do we do that sometimes? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Of course. Absolutely.
We hear this story sometimes with farmers, out in the Midwest, they got huge crops, and they get sick, they have heart attack, they get cancer, and they think, well, I've got a real problem. I'm in the hospital, I cannot get my crops. And then here comes 6 or 7 neighbors with combines just knock it out just like that. And maybe those people aren't gonna starve to death. That sure is a nice
Sure.
thing to have.
Absolutely.
If you're sick, you can't mow your yard, and the yards get too deep, I mean, it's nice for somebody to say, I'll take care of it.
Right.
They don't tell you nothing, they don't mow it, don't know that.
I think it's a lot of big problem with human nature is we automatically start thinking about all the reasons we can't do it.
Yep.
Instead of thinking about how we can or the reasons we can. That's the first one, motion that wants to come up, so I can't do that because it's not.
Right.
We start limiting ourselves and cutting ourselves off before we even try.
And it's interesting that you say that, because the disciples were ready to send them home before they'd even done the math about how much food was there, right? It made a lot more sense after they realized how much food, but they would send them home even beforehand. Let's go to the next one. That's the unforgiving servant. This is from Matthew chapter 18. Booty, care to read this one? It's 18:21 through 35. I've got two slides here if you want it up here, or if you want to take it from your own Bible. I don't know if this is true as a story a billion times in world history. Probably relate or maybe even have examples. Story told in two parts, right? The first guy is indebted, and what does his master do for him? He forgives it, right? He forgives it, which is what we would hope to be able to do, right? We would hope that somebody would forgive us. And then the man who was forgiven immediately goes out and does what? He makes his servants pay him. But not only that, what does he do to the people that owed him a debt? He put them in jail. Not even just, I need it by Friday. It's put them in jail and treat them horrible all the way through. Where is the compassion? And then where is the compassion missing in this story? Uh-huh. Absolutely. Are we sometimes guilty of that? Somebody helps us, but then we don't sort of pay it forward. We don't help other people. Yes. It was a great thing that he got his debt forgiven. That was awesome. But I still need to get paid on this other side, right? That was the last verse there says, "So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not," here's the last part, "forgive his brother of his trespasses." Do you remember in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verses 6 and verses 7, the model prayer there, right? How we are to pray. One of the sentences there, it says to forgive us of what? Our debts or our trespasses. It's a different version, say different things, but either one covers the same thing. But forgive us of our debts as we what? So we're asking, forgive us. It's a prayer. So who's that request going to? God, forgive us as we, that's going to me, does what? So how can I expect forgiveness from up here if I will not forgive anyone that I come in contact with? We struggle with this though, right? But it's different. Yep.
We can all forgive somebody, say we forgive somebody,
Mhm.
but really just truly forgive them in your heart was
But Ben, you don't know how many times I've had to deal with this guy. There's a good follow-up right there. Do we think like that though? We've all said the sentence that I just said, right? I tell you, I don't know if I can deal with this guy anymore. Well, how many times is God going to say it? What does it say in the earlier part of the reading? How many times we've forgiven? Time to get calculators out, right? 490 is what the number is, but that's not what it means. It's telling you, when do you stop forgiving? You never, and that's really hard, right? But like Ben said, how many times have we been forgiven? How many times have we prayed and said something along the lines of, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned? Well, every single time, right? Don't you ever think that God probably thinks, man, it'd be nice if they'd quit ever so often? But that's just not human nature, right? We make mistakes, but we know, because the Bible tells us, that we have an avenue to ask for forgiveness. Why can we not extend that avenue sometimes to the people that come in contact with us on a daily basis?
And then when it says it delivered him to the master delivered him to the torture.
Yes.
Then it says, so my heavenly Father also do to each of you.
Right.
From the heart if you go to it. So that's
Absolutely. Two blind men. Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 34. Matthew 20, 29 through 34. Jimmy, do you care to read this one?
As they went out of Jericho, great multitude followed him, and behold, two blind men sitting by the road. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David. Then the multitude warned him that they should be quiet, but they cried out all the more, saying, have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David. So Jesus stood still and called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion, touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him.
Have you ever heard somebody say, it's not what you said, but how you said it? I want us to look at that verse right there in verse 32. Kind of bracket verse 32 for a second, because in this story, Jesus is walking by here as they come out of Jericho, and these two blind men are saying what? Oh Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And the people that's around them told them what? Basically, shut up, be quiet, be quiet. They don't need, but they said what? They cried out more. Why did they cry out a second time, do you think? They needed help and they wanted Jesus to hear him. So I want us to look then at verse 32. So Jesus stood still and called on them and said, now look at this verse. What do you want me to do for you? Now let's say it one of two ways. What do you want me to do for you? Or what do you want me to do for you? It's all in how you read it. Because we could read that either way, right? How many times have we answered or have we uttered that same sentence as Jesus, but said it, what do you want me to do for you? Do we sometimes, I'm willing to help, but my goodness, I'm tired of helping you. We sometimes say it like this, don't we? We kind of fall into that. But I don't think that's the way Jesus said it because of the last two verses. They said to him, Lord, that our eyes may be open. These were blind men, and it seems to me like if I was blind and you could help me, I would go try and get that help wherever it could be. And so then Jesus what? Well, what's the word there? He had what? He had compassion for them, for their eye, touched their eyes, and immediately what? They received sight. There's no period at the end of sight, though. Comma and what? And they followed him. They realized at the beginning of the verse that their help, their salvation would come from where? It didn't come at the end of the verse. They recognized it at the beginning. In verse 29, they already recognized where it was going to be. And they said, I will do whatever I can. If I have to yell a little louder, I'll do it. Because they realized where their help would come from. And it came, and then how do they respond? They followed him right there.
Talk about being able to put yourself in a situation. Whenever you see Jesus healing people, especially the blind people, it's never the same way twice.
Yes.
It's always how that person needs help or what
Yep.
that person needs to be able to believe that he can be faithful.
There are numerous examples of Jesus helping or healing people or whatever, almost in passing. And this is an example of him passing. And on almost every time when Jesus is moving from point A to point B, here it says they're coming out of Jericho, but when they're moving from point A to point B, somebody needs help, and there's almost always other people saying, "Nah, let's move on," right? And you can kind of see that somebody's telling them, "Pipe down," right? This guy's got more important things to do. Do we sometimes have more important things to do? We can't. We think we do. We do sometimes think that. And so right here, though, Jesus hears and then helps. A couple more. One that you'll be familiar with. Jesus heals a leper. Will, do you care to read this? It's Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 42.
Now the leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed.
Now, this is probably a story that we're all pretty familiar with here, right? But the leper, and of course we know with leprosy, you were sort of an outcast because it was extremely contagious, but comes to him, kneels down and says what? "If you are willing, you can make me clean." I like the approach here because I feel like if somebody was able to help me, I'd almost say, "Help me make it better," right? We're not. That's kind of what we would say. But he said, "If you are willing," right? If you are willing. He has this disease and he would love to see it cleansed, but he wants, he says, if Jesus is willing. And Jesus then, moved with compassion, does what? Touched him. Strike one immediately right there. Nobody's going to do that. And we might look at this and we say, wait a minute, Jesus is putting himself in a really awkward situation right here. Potentially dangerous situation. You ever heard of Mother Teresa? The Catholic nun that went to India in the 40s, I think, stayed for about 40 years, worked in the slums of Calcutta with the people, mostly with people that were lepers. That was who she worked with. And people told her when she went, "This is a really bad idea." Why? You're going to get leprosy and you're going to die. Do we look at things a lot of times that same way? Ooh, what kind of situation you putting yourself in right there? Jesus, the guy, noticeably the guy doesn't touch Jesus. And I think there's a sign of respect there. But Jesus touches him and says, "I am willing." And then what? Be cleansed. Didn't take much. It's interesting that Jesus's efforts at healing take very little effort, do they? But like Ben said, there's a lot of different approaches that are used. But he says, "I am willing, be cleansed." And it says right there, as soon as he had spoken, what happened? Leprosy had left him and he was cleansed. If they didn't, they wouldn't have went. They wouldn't have went in the first place. The compassion is clearly there. I don't know that when people are baptized, I don't know that we usually say, "I am willing, be cleansed," but we could say the same thing, right? Because that's the same thing. As soon as it happens, when are we healed, if we want to use that word for baptism? Right then and there. Arise. No. And realistically, Jesus could have said what to him? No, he could have easily said. There's examples, we talked about this last Sunday, where the woman who was a Gentile, she wanted Jesus to heal her daughter, and it really wasn't the right thing to do, right? He was there to teach the gospel to who? The Jew first, right? But then he's like, she said it a second time, and he heals, and he raises the daughter from the dead right there. But we see over and over again, it might have been inconvenient. It might have been sort of improper. It might have been unhealthy. But what did Jesus do? Absolutely.
And it wasn't like a "you heal me right now," and it wasn't a "if you're who you say you are."
Absolutely.
None of that. Simply, "I believe in you, and if you will help me, I appreciate it."
Yeah.
And he did not have to touch it.
No.
That was where Jesus did
No, absolutely.
He told, the other stuff, she's healed.
Yeah.
But he did, I think that told this leper that you're poor.
Yes.
I think if a homeless man, somebody who's been real bad off, nobody homeless want to just go over and hug him and take a pat. That's what Jesus does. This guy hadn't been had human touch in years. And to have that first touch of human conformance and compassion, I imagine it's never broken his heart.
Sure. We have two more. One, this is the widow's son. I think we're in Luke right here, chapter 7, verses 11 through 15. Jill, do you care to read this? Luke 7, 11 through 15. 9, yeah.
When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came and touched the other coffin, and those who carried it stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother.
So in the story here, Jesus sort of strolls into town, as it were, and he, in a sense here, he kind of comes upon a funeral, right? And this person, this boy, this man, or however you want to describe it, had died, but it's kind of a double problem here, right? He was her what? Son, but she was also what? A widow. And this has some cultural problems that would have been really challenging for somebody there at the time. But this would be difficult for us as well. If it was something, if you had one child and one spouse and they both have died, you're going to be in our world, it might be a very lonely situation. In her world, it would have been a financial strife that would have come from it. But Jesus's first words to her here are what? Well, first of all, he had compassion on her and he said, "Do not weep," which sometimes, well, let me rephrase. Based on what we've read up until what Jesus said right here, that feels like the absolute worst thing to say, right? Why does that seem like a really bad thing to say? To walk up to a woman at a funeral whose husband's already dead and her son just died, and you walk up and say, "Do not weep." Why does that feel like that might not be the best thing to say? Feels like that's the only thing that you could do right there was weep. But why did he tell her not to weep?
But you can read that like "do not weep."
Uh-huh.
Jesus, that kind.
Sure.
Just picture sweet voice.
Right. And he touched the coffin, and those who carried him out stood still. And he set up, so he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother right there. It's an example of Jesus, once again, in a situation where didn't have to help. I mean, here's a person that's dead, right? Sometimes you might be looking at this and you say, "Well, Daniel, I can't bring somebody up out of a coffin. That's not possible." That's fair. But the other day, after Joyce's funeral, we drove, and I still don't know if I can get to Providence from Broadhead. That's just not the way I've known how to go. But we pulled out, and they took us out, and you pull out onto the bypass, or the new one. And as we drove, and then we turned on 70, and then we turned again, there were cars and trucks that stopped along the way. And to me, I still think that's the best part of a funeral. I don't know that. I'm sure that people who stop at funerals like that, I'm sure a lot of them are fidgeting with the radio and talking on the phone or texting somebody or whatever. But the occasions when those happen, I find myself when I stop, and for this brief moment, there's this thought of wonder who that is, or do I have any connection, or no? And odds are, even in small towns, there's a good chance that you may not know them right there. But to me, that's something that we can do. And I don't know that it means that much, but it means a lot more. I don't know how to define what it means. Is that fair to say right there? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that? That's not really what this story is about, but that's what I wanted to mention with this.
It's just an utmost show of respect. It's kind of a cultural thing.
It is.
But you can also think, all of us stopped many times, I was in Russell a couple weeks ago, and do not have to stop, but you should probably.
Legally, you really shouldn't. It's not. It's actually you would be at fault in a wreck. Uh-huh. Right.
But Ann Russell's right, she said, I'm gonna pull over, she said, I think that's what we should do.
Mhm.
But everybody that does that has lost somebody, they know they could be next, somebody could be, it's just a sign of real respect. Daddy did it with little,
One more. We're gone a little over. I apologize. But the parable of the lost son, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 24. Ben, do you care to read this one? Go ahead. I'm sorry. It's a second slide. So.
Then it said, a certain man who had 2 sons, and the younger then said to his father, Father, give me the portion of my goods that falls to me. So he divided unto his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with wild liquor. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed the swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servant, Bring out the best robe and put it on, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here to kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry.
Not a new story, one that we're all familiar with here, but I think a good one to show an example at the end, because this, in some of the earliest ones, we could easily say, well, those are all things that Jesus did, and I'm not Jesus, so I couldn't do that. But this last one is not something that Jesus does, right? And where is the compassion in this series of verses? Was any of this, I don't want to say necessary, that's not the right, but was there a place for the father here to sort of fuss at the son? Was there a place for, I told you so? There absolutely was. Was there a place for, I wish you'd have just stayed here and been like your brother, it'd been a lot less trouble for me?
Kind of the story behind it is the kid basically forced his father.
Mm-hmm.
Because the kids could force their parents to go ahead and give them their inheritance.
Yeah.
So basically the kid is taking his father to court and making him do it.
It's a level of sort of disrespect toward the father at the very beginning. But toward the very, as about halfway through, the son says he realizes the mistakes that he's made. And he said, I'm sitting here eating what the pigs don't want to eat. And I could be at home, eating everything. And when he comes home, again, it's not a new story. We're all familiar. But you would expect sort of a knock on the door and it's like, well, but the story here says the father was what? Was watching, waiting for him. And when the boy gets close, what's the father do? It's the total opposite of what we would expect, right? He'd almost say, you need to come over and hug me but that's not what he does. He runs and almost To me, it almost is like he tackles him almost. He's so happy to see him right there. Was there a place for telling this boy that he had done wrong? He did.
I don't think it'd be necessary.
I don't think so. Would he have been wrong to have told him that he'd done wrong? No.
But he also, the son went back, not with treat me like I'm anything special.
Yep.
He went back with the attitude.
I'll be the lowest man on the totem pole.
I don't want to be lower than this one.
But so if we're thinking about compassion, we're thinking about empathy, sometimes we're almost ready to get kind of our pound of flesh right there. I told you so. And I don't know that that helps anybody in this situation. Right now, that boy didn't need to, and you know, a month later, they might need to, you know, have a serious conversation. I don't know. But it seemed like everybody knew where they were wrong in the process of this. And sometimes we're a little over eager to tell people where they're wrong. So I want to look 5 things real quick, and I know we're going over, and I apologize. But how to grow compassion and empathy. I got 5 things right here. First of all, talk with other people. There's no way that you can learn empathy and compassion without talking to other people. If you don't talk with anybody, you don't know what other people are going through. And that's one of the, I've had, you know, I've been teaching for almost 20 years, and people sometimes say, how do you deal with students? Talk to them. And not about social studies. You know, ask them about soccer, or ask them about the band, or ask them about their job or their parents or who they're related to. Did I have your brother? You got a sister that's younger than you? That kind of thing. But we have to talk with others. Number 2, help break down struggles into smaller obstacles. How many of us have ever just felt overwhelmed by stuff? The first principal class that I took was the first class I'd taken in like 10 or 11 years. And the first assignment dealt with Excel spreadsheets. And I was about 10 minutes into it and said, I don't want to go to school ever again right there. Because I got 8 more of these classes that I've got to take, and I hate every part of this. But then I realized I don't have to take all 8 classes tonight. I have to do 1 assignment tonight. Sometimes we can get a little overwhelmed, right? We got too many things going on. Help try to break it down into smaller obstacles. Number 3, and I think this is important, tell your own story, but not at the expense of other people. Sometimes we want to tell everybody all the things that we did to get through these issues, but they're not facing the same thing you did. It might be the same thing, but it's not the same thing. Does that make sense? Their parent may have passed away and your parent passed away, but the situation is totally different. You can tell yours, but don't lead with yours. Let them go first. We can't develop empathy if the only thing we want to talk about is ourselves. Number 4, pray with each other and for each other. And number 5, work together. Every example of Jesus that we've looked at tonight showed action, right? Was there ever any passive lacking in what Jesus did? Every example showed action. Some of those actions required a lot of work. Some of those actions required very little work. Some of those are things that you and I can't do, but the action is something that we can. The question there at the bottom, how do the ways we act toward people reflect our attitude toward God?
If we have the proper attitude and respect and love for God, then we're going to love God's creation. We're going to have, if we realize how much compassion and mercy He's had on us, that's going to spill over to people we come into contact with.
May be difficult. It can be difficult. But the easiest thing is just to simply say, I don't want to deal with this. But we had 7 stories tonight of examples where Jesus very easily could have said what? I don't want to deal with this. But at every single example, he did. And that's where, to me, the compassion and the empathy is. And we have to be willing to say, I can try to help you with whatever this is. So tonight, I hope this has helped some. I think there's been some biblical and some sort of practical application that can go as well. I hope that there's something here that benefited you in the process. And I hope that you don't think that I'm really good at this, because I'm not necessarily that good at it either. But I don't know that any of us are that good at it. And there's only one thing that we can do is try to keep getting better and better at it. Because the thing about this is there's always going to be a need for compassion, and there's always going to be a need for empathy in the rest of our lives. If we live 10 minutes or 10 years or 10 million years, there's always going to be a need for it. If there's anything we can do, any way we can help you, we'd certainly invite you to come while we stand and sing.
I am resolved no